HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Saddest Words, William Faulkner's Civil War, by Michael Gorra, read by Joe Barrett. Preface. A Park Bench in Paris. What can the work of William Faulkner tell us about the Civil War, that central quarrel of our nation's history? And what do that war's dark hours tell us about the 1949 Nobel laureate, the most important American novelist of the 20th century? How might we use them to think about each other? The war is everywhere in the Mississippi-born Faulkner, both an inescapable point of reference in his characters' speeches and lives, and a determining factor in the very form of his fiction. He can no more get away from it than we can ourselves, from a conflict whose causes and consequences remain inscribed today on our every electoral map. But the war is also nowhere, in that he rarely makes it an explicit subject. At times it seems an ellipsis in his work, a lacuna, the eye of a hurricane, the still center of destruction. He doesn't do big battle scenes or follow the course of a campaign. The great generals are for him but names, not characters, and so too are Gettysburg and Shiloh, or they stand rather as offstage events whose reverberations can be felt forever. This book defines both the war's actual presence in Faulkner's work, those moments set during the struggle itself, and his account of its undiminished echo in the decades that follow. It uses the Civil War to help us understand the whole body of Faulkner's fiction, and it uses that fiction, in which the same characters and incidents recur in work after work, to help us understand that war from secession through Reconstruction, and on into our continual revision and rewriting of its history. Yet this book is also about the Civil War within Faulkner himself, his own struggling attempt to come to terms with the war's meaning, which is to say, with slavery, his attempt and ours. William Faulkner was born in 1897 in New Albany, Mississippi, a whistle stop 40 miles south of the Tennessee border. He moved as a child to nearby Oxford, the home of the state's university and the seat of Lafayette County. And there he stayed. In his 20s, Faulkner lived briefly in New York and New Orleans. He later spent a few years writing for the movies in Hollywood. Oxford nevertheless remained his home, his source, and he set almost all his work in and around what he called his little postage stamp of native soil. That work drew on the history of his native region from the days of the first contact between white settlers and the indigenous Chickasaw people, through the establishment of a town he called Jefferson and the growth of a plantation economy based upon cotton and slaves, through the Civil War and its aftermath, and on into the world of the New South and the automobiles and bootleggers of his own day. He was a superb historian and a better myth-maker. He called his imaginary place Yoknapatawpha County, after an actual local river, and the world he made of it is as vividly detailed as that of any fictional landscape, a setting matched only by the fever dream of Dickens's London. His work contains the richest gallery of characters in all of American literature, and in his handling of time and consciousness, Faulkner stands as one of his century's most restless experimenters in any language with the form of the novel itself. He was an uncompromising modernist, a difficult American counterpart to James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, yet he also offered a distinctive regional voice, a hypnotic stylist who shaped the half-century of Southern writers that followed him, some walking in his path and others struggling to get as far away as possible. For many 20th-century readers, those strengths were enough. 40 years ago, I was a new college graduate, teaching in a summer school where one of the novels on the syllabus assigned to me was his 1930 As I Lay Dying. I didn't much like it, not at first. I felt disoriented by the speed with which Faulkner switched from one first-person narrator to another, 15 of them in all, and frustrated by my inability to tell just when the book was set. He began in a pre-industrial farmhouse and ended in the glare of Jefferson's electric lights. But some things stuck. One of the book's narrators told me that words don't ever fit even what they are trying to say at, and another announced that my mother is a fish. I'd never read anything like it, and knew after my first class that I wanted to read more, and immediately. I wrestled with The Sound and the Fury, in which both memory and chronology appeared to splinter, and then I seemed to fall down a great well, drowning in the Jazz-Age despair of Sanctuary and the Civil War stories of The Unvanquished. I read The Ghoulish A Rose for Emily, and both struggled and failed to understand the family history embedded in The Bear, where incest and slavery stood as one. Flags in the Dust taught me about the corporate life of what Faulkner called his apocryphal town, and at the end of that summer I felt my jaw go slack at the Hall of Mirrors named Absalom, as though the novelist had taken a bolt gun to my brain. I have been reading and teaching Faulkner ever since, but the novelist I read today isn't the one I read then, even if the words are exactly the same. In his lifetime, and for some years after, the usual way to make sense of him was to stress the contrast between the different groups of his white characters. On the one hand were the representatives of the Old South, the descendants of slave owners and planters, like the Compson family of The Sound and the Fury, and the Sartorises from Flags in the Dust. On the other were the up-from-nothing Snopes clan, erstwhile sharecroppers who in the capitalist post-Civil War world of the New South had replaced the old order. That was the view of the left-wing editor Malcolm Cowley in The Portable Faulkner, the 1946 anthology that first suggested the scale and coherence of the writer's achievement. To Cowley, Yoknapatawpha's old families embodied a sense of honor and tradition, and though they rarely lived up to it, they were at least conscious that they'd slipped. The Snopeses, in contrast, stood as a moral infestation, gnawing like rats at the standards by which the South had lived, and Cowley's argument found its counterpart on the right in a band of writers who had emerged in the 1920s at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. They called themselves the Agrarians, and the set included the poets John Crow Ransom and Allen Tate, along with a young Kentuckian named Robert Penn Warren, who would find his own greatness with the 1946 novel about a corrupt Southern politician, the Pulitzer Prize-winning All the King's Men. The book remains best known for a book called I'll Take My Stand, 1930, a collection of essays by 12 Southerners that set the image of an idealized agricultural order against the industrial world of modernity itself. The agrarians saw the nation as divided still, not into slave states or free, but between a firmly rooted rural subsistence on the one hand and the dislocating forces of the urban market on the other. Yet the regional distinction remained as before, a distinction they prized and celebrated. Virtue lay below the Mason-Dixon line, and the tone of their manifesto was set by the title Ransom gave to his own piece, Reconstructed but Unregenerate. They were Faulkner's contemporaries and among his earliest and most admiring readers, but as apologists for a peculiarly Southern tradition, they underplayed his quarrel with our nation's irrepressible fractures, and he always kept his distance, for the South that the agrarians imagined was in essence a land without black people. They wrote slavery out of its history, seeing it as but one aspect of the region's past and not its organizing principle, and their readings of Faulkner scanted the importance his work gave both to it and the Civil War itself. In Faulkner criticism, the canonical version of that argument came in a book by Warren's friend, colleague, and collaborator, Cleanth Brooks. As young faculty members at Louisiana State in the 1930s, they had founded the Southern Review and edited a foundational classroom anthology called Understanding Poetry. Later, they each moved to Yale. Their way of teaching a poem required a student to abstract it from its social matrix, a close reading that concentrated almost exclusively on questions of form, voice, irony, metaphor, paradox. They push biography aside, history too, and it's never been difficult to see the connection between what became known as the New Criticism and the agrarians' desire to look away from the central facts of the South's past. Of course, no practice is ever so pure as its theory, and in William Faulkner, The Yoknapatawpha Country, 1963, Brooks took far more account of the historical context of Faulkner's work than he ever did with the 17th century lyric. Nevertheless, he read for structure and symbol above all, and flinched whenever Faulkner asked his readers to look hard at that past retreating instead into generalities about man and time and community. Nor did Brooks himself finally look hard enough at his subject, at the things the novelist could not or would not say. Faulkner's students haven't stopped investigating his representation of human consciousness or the intricacies of his prose, but such readings in themselves are no longer adequate, and I'll suggest why through a comparison to the British writer Joseph Conrad. In 1977, the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe published an essay called An Image of Africa, in which he upended 80 years' worth of commentary on Conrad's 1899 Heart of Darkness. That short novel had often been read as a critique of European imperialism. The conquest of the earth, Conrad's narrator Marlowe said, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much, and most readers heard the deadly understatement in the character's voice. They took the story as an attack on the savagery of 19th-century colonialism, and it did in fact shape public awareness of the atrocities on which Belgian rule in the Congo depended. Achebe argued, in contrast, that the tale lent a tacit support to the politics it appeared to condemn. It equated blackness with evil, and emptied the African continent of its peoples and histories by depicting Marlowe's steamboat journey upriver as a voyage back into the earliest days of the earth itself, a primitivist trip into the continent's supposedly empty heart. At the level of its language and its choice of words and metaphors, the story depended on a racism engraved within England itself, and Achebe suggested that we should simply stop reading it. The paradox is that his argument has only made Conrad's work seem all the more central, all the more interesting, and marked out a field of investigation that has turned Heart of Darkness into a locus of continuing debate about the relation, the inextricability of imperialism and modernity itself. Many later readings have therefore explored the story with an eye to its internal contradictions, using Conrad to consider the limits of what can and cannot be thought in a given culture at a given time. Faulkner learned a great deal from Conrad, above all how to nest one narrative, one voice, within another. And our reading of The Mississippian has undergone a similar metamorphosis. No single work of Faulkner criticism has had so decisive an effect as An Image of Africa, but an accumulation of scholarship has indeed changed the way we see him. Figures like Brooks were of course aware of Faulkner's context, of how much his work depended on his precise historical moment, but they moved swiftly past the local and saw him instead in terms of some abstract human condition. A more recent and historically grounded criticism has returned him to that moment. Scholars have examined his relation to the literary marketplace, to Cold War culture, to Hollywood, and to the many writers like Toni Morrison, whose work stands in agonistic relation to his own. They have studied his account of labor and gender and the environment. They have in particular looked closely and often skeptically at his treatment of race, his portraits of black characters, and the ventriloquism with which he presents black speech, his depiction of slavery and of the intersection of sex and servitude, his way of registering what Morrison herself defines as the Africanist presence in American life. At the height of his career in the 1930s and 40s, Faulkner was seen as a moderate on the South's racial questions, and many white Mississippians viewed him with suspicion. He thought World War II would bring a long-overdue shift in the country's social structure by forcing the politicians to make good the shibboleth they glibly talk about freedom, liberty, human rights. Nevertheless, he remained a white man of the Jim Crow South and did not always rise above it. At times his words both can and should make us uncomfortable, though perhaps more with the man than the work, which I know begs a question. Yet one that only makes the business of reading him more urgent. He stands to us as Conrad does to the study of imperialism, with our understanding made ever more urgent by Faulkner's very limitations. And by us, I don't mean the South alone. Faulkner's early readers saw a quarrel in his work between Sartoris and Snopes, the Old South and the New. Today that seems like pocket change, and the story he offers us instead is that of the nation itself. One day in the late fall of 2010, I sat in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris, at the edge of a circle of grass, looking out through the trees at the wrought iron fence that marked the park's edge. There was a gravel path at my feet, a dabbling of shade in the greenery, and behind me I could hear the faint thunk of a tennis ball in the distance and the voices of men playing boule. I was trying to finish a book that year, spending most of my time at a study center a few streets away, but my mind wouldn't work that morning, and I'd walked off into the garden's hush. It was one of my favorite places in the city, and I knew it had been one of Faulkner's as well. He had first come to Paris in August 1925, sailing on a freighter from New Orleans and landing in Genoa before crossing the Alps to the north. He was 27 and unknown, a would-be writer who had just finished his first novel, Soldier's Pay, but didn't yet know if the New York publisher to whom he had sent the book would take it. The firm was called Boni and Liveright, and is specialized in the consciously modern. Its list included both T.S. Eliot and Faulkner's own mentor, Sherwood Anderson, along with a writer 2 years his junior named Ernest Hemingway. Paris in the 1920s has become a place of fable, one of the capital cities of American literary history. Gertrude Stein had lived in the Rue de Fleurus, just a few blocks away from the bench where I was sitting, the walls of her apartment lined with Picassos and Cézannes. And in the very summer of Faulkner's visit, Hemingway was at work on The Sun Also Rises, just a bit to the south on Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs. Faulkner met neither of them during his 2-month stay. He met nobody, and when he saw James Joyce in a cafe, he did not dare to speak. Instead, he spent as much time as possible in the gardens themselves, telling his mother that I sit and write there and walk around to watch the children and the croquet. Nothing he wrote in Paris has lasted, but 5 years later he would set the final page of Sanctuary in the park's gray light with the dead-eyed rape victim Temple Drake sitting in the sad gloom of its trees. That was Faulkner's only trip to Europe until he won the Nobel Prize a quarter of a century on. But I wasn't thinking about him as I sat there. I was thinking instead of the news from home. Each morning I opened up the New York Times on my computer, and for the last few weeks one of my regular coffee-time pleasures had been a column on its op-ed page called Disunion. It was 150 years since Lincoln had been elected president, and the paper had decided to follow the week-by-week course of the war that followed, with different historians providing bulletins on what had happened. Adam Goodhart, for example, had described what he called the last ordinary day, a week before the 1860 election, when Colonel Robert E. Lee was still a member of the United States Army, stationed in Texas and worrying about Comanches. In other installments, I read about the election's aftermath, about the doubts and fears that Herman Melville tried to capture in his poetry, and of Lincoln's fascination with a map that showed the relative density of the South's slave population. But something else filled the news at the end of 2010 and set off a strange, disturbing echo. There had been an election back home, and my side had done badly, losing a political momentum that only lately had appeared unstoppable. For a year I've been reading about something called the Tea Party, a movement I found hard to understand. Radically conservative and populist at once, suspicious of the federal government in general and of its recent actions in particular, the Affordable Care Act above all. The Tea Party borrowed its name from a 1773 tax revolt in Boston, and some of its cadres had taken an old Revolutionary War-era motto as their own, "Don't tread on me." They talked, among other things, about nullification, a 19th century theory that claimed an individual state had the power to reject a federal law. I had thought that was a dead letter, a belief that had vanished even before the Civil War. Now it seemed back, and the more I read, the more the Tea Party appeared to speak not of colonial New England, but rather of the South in the age of disunion, to put a libertarian hood on something much older and more troubling. But out of our business. The issues seemed all the same, as if our time rang off the world of 1860, and nothing had ever stopped or changed or gone away. So I began to listen harder, listen more. And yet I followed that echo by paying attention not to the American present, but rather to its past, reading about the Civil War with a depth and a passion that the period had never before aroused in me. I began with a few books on particular battles, borrowed from the city's superb American library in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. I soon found, however, that I was more interested in the memory of the war, in our different attempts to define what it meant, and buried myself in the 800 pages of Edmund Wilson's Patriotic Gore, 1962. Wilson describes the various ways in which the war's participants and observers had written about it, beginning with Harriet Beecher Stowe in the 1850s and ending in the early 20th century with Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., who, as an officer in a Massachusetts regiment, had been wounded 3 times. Wilson wrote about Lincoln's speeches and the stories of Ambrose Bierce, about Confederate poets and the post-war attempts of the South's supposed statesmen to justify themselves. He showed how the conflict had changed the American language, making it ever more lean and plain and visceral, and all studies of the war's literary aftermath must start with him still. After that, I picked up Robert Penn Warren's Legacy of the Civil War, 1961, written for the conflict's centennial, and then David Blight's Race and Reunion, 2001, which told me how the North had lost the peace. Drew Gilpin Faust's This Republic of Suffering, 2008, showed how the nation had dealt with its dead, both their physical bodies and their memories. George Fredrickson's Inner Civil War, 1965, detailed its psychic effect on a generation of New England intellectuals. Then early in 2011, the Library of America published a volume called The Civil War, the first year told by those who lived it, the first of a series of 4. I snatched it up the day it appeared on the library shelves, gulping down such things as the report of the South Carolina diarist Mary Chestnut on the attack at Fort Sumter and Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman's letter to his wife about the Union debacle at Bull Run. Living abroad had made me far more consciously interested in my own country than I had ever been before, as though distance had given me new eyes. It made me realize that I needed to look more closely at our history and our literature to sort out what I thought about the American past. That meant writing about it, an act of citizenship as much as scholarship, an American book by someone whose academic specialty had until then been the British novel. I would read everything. I would, why not, rewrite patriotic gore itself. Or so I told myself. Until one day I realized that I could say anything I wanted to about the Civil War by taking up a writer I already knew, a dialectic in which I could use the war and the novelist to read each other. A dialectic implies a synthesis, but I prefer to think of myself as telling a story, a critical narrative in which Faulkner's chronicle of his imagined land will find itself entwined with our country's history, and with other voices too, the diaries and letters of the war years, and the memoirs of the generation after, other novelists as well, and then the historians who, in trying to make sense of it all, seem to tell us as much about their own moment as they do about the war itself. One voice has been especially present as I've sat up over this preface. James Baldwin's Stranger in the Village, 1953, describes a winter stay in an isolated Swiss hamlet called Leukerbad. I have known that essay almost as long as I've known Faulkner's own work, and I never reread it without a sense of profound discomfort and uneasiness with American life and my own cushioned place within it. Baldwin knows that he's a stranger in the Alps, the first black man most of the villagers have ever seen, but he is not a stranger in America, despite the best efforts of its white citizens to treat him as one. For the history of our shared country, he argues, is the history of the way white people have tried both to recognize and to deny the humanity of their black neighbors. The problem all white Americans must confront is that of learning how to live with him in order to live with themselves, and though Baldwin never mentions Faulkner, his conclusion might have been written with the older novelist in mind. For even when the worst has been said, it must also be added that the perpetual challenge posed by this problem was always, somehow, perpetually met. Always met because never quite avoided, because that problem has stood, more often than not, at the center of our political life. In his greatest books, Faulkner accepted that challenge. He faced it, fought with himself, too. Never adequately, as we will see, not in ways that would satisfy us today, or that could satisfy Baldwin then. Yet his very blind spots and uncertainties have lessons for us, and that challenge remains itself without end. Hence my title, The Saddest Words. There are 2 of them, and they come from The Sound and the Fury, Faulkner's first great novel. In that book, an alcoholic Jefferson lawyer named Jason Compson, the son of a Confederate general, tells his own son Quentin that was is the saddest word of all. Something that was is fixed and unchangeable, forever in the past, an event, a mistake, that can be neither altered nor redressed. The very thought of what he can't undo in his own family life has been enough to send him to the bottle. Though no reader stops with that family, we push beyond to history itself, an entire past that can never be made right. And his son will find a sadder word. Away in New England and planning to kill himself at the end of his first year at Harvard, Quentin will think that, again, is even sadder than was, saddest of all. For the term suggests that what was has simply gone on happening, a cycle of repetition that replays itself forever. That's how it is in Faulkner's South, a land where the dead past walks, not was, but is, and burning always in one's mind. What was is never over. There have been moments in our history, brief ones, when the meaning of the Civil War has seemed settled. This isn't one of them. Not when the illusion that this country might become a post-racial society lies in tatters. Again, that's precisely why Faulkner remains so valuable. That very recurrence makes him necessary. How should we read him today? My answer begins on a July day in 1863, with history rather than fiction, and in Pennsylvania, not Mississippi, with Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy's greatest icon, and the biggest battle ever fought in North America. 1. Gettysburg had not yet two. At sunrise on the battle's second day, the general stood on a low ridge to the west of the Pennsylvania town and looked out over a shallow valley of fields and orchards. The place itself lay below him, a county seat of 2,400 people and of no strategic importance whatsoever. But a dozen country roads ran into a knot at Gettysburg's center, and the day before some of his troops had gone blundering up one of them and into a waiting body of enemy cavalry. Robert E. Lee had heard the guns when he was still miles away, and by the time he reached the field, it was already too late. A skirmish had become a general engagement almost before he knew it, and certainly before he wanted it. Still, he had gotten most of his men there first, ahead of the other side's advance, and by the end of the day had put his headquarters atop a hill that his opponents had held that morning, on the grounds of a Lutheran seminary. The school's main building had a high cupola and would have made a good lookout, but it had now become a field hospital, its wide halls filled with the wounded men of both armies. The general wouldn't allow himself to disturb their groans, and instead took a spot under a tree outside, his aides clustered around him, and raised his field glasses into the dawn. There was another ridge a mile away to the southeast, and it too was low. Not a hard climb, not at all, not unless the people on top were shooting at you. His soldiers had driven the Federals back upon it the day before, pushing them off Seminary Ridge and then hitting them from the north as well, harrying them through the streets of the town itself, until in the fading light the Bluebellies had found a refuge on its heights. Lee had won the day. He could call it a victory, and yet it was a disappointment, too, for the Union's battered forces had been just one short hill away, and he had told his lieutenants that he wished to take that hill if practicable. It hadn't been. The chance was lost. They would have to fight again. And in the day's first light he could see through his glasses that the enemy's tattered lines had begun to fill. New regiments, brigades, divisions had come up and fallen into place on the opposite crest, extending the front his men would have to face. His own strength had also grown in the night, as one commander after another pushed along those country roads, but their job would be harder than he'd expected. Those people were waiting for him on what was called Cemetery Ridge, and that was where he would have to attack them. And now it was the steaming third day of both July and the battle alike, and the enemy was still there. On the second, Lee had sent one prong of his army to the north and another to the south, but his commanders couldn't coordinate their attacks, and neither of them had the speed the assault required. They had marched and countermarched, hoping for a surprise, and the main blow had not been launched until late in the afternoon. It smashed an enemy corps, and his troops had given him 3 brilliant murderous hours, but though he gained some ground, the day had to count as a failure. The opposing army still held that ridge, and had even been reinforced. Despite their casualties, their ranks had continued to swell. His own reserves were thin by comparison, and yet his faith in his soldiers remained unshaken.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?